How's it going, everybody? My name is fallinghurts, and I'm going to be quite frank with you. This is my second time recording this video, and while I could just redo the script that I did from the first one, I did quite a bit of riffing. And then when I went to go and actually edit the audio before putting it to some gameplay for this review, it actually thematically kind of matched the game I'm talking about today, Conscript, by sounding like I was actually wearing a gas mask. Now, all jokes aside, I was already really late to putting out this review, so I figured why not just, instead of trying to salvage that audio, just go ahead and redo it. And as they always say, better late than never. Although I must admit, the source material for this game has now changed from World War I to World War II. That being said, hello, my name is fallinghurts, and as I already said, we're reviewing Conscript, a top-down survival horror game set in the trenches of World War I. In short, I really loved this game. And as far as modern horror is concerned, it's intuitive in its design and satisfying to both play and to look at. And might I add, it plays a lot more subtle in the earlier hours with suspense and atmosphere above all of those flashy scares. Another thing to note, I played a lot of this playthrough on my Steam Deck, and yeah, it's verified, it runs great, and if that's where you're looking to play the game, you absolutely can do that, which means you can play the game anywhere. Outside of there, you can play it also on Xbox, Switch, and even PlayStation, and the game really meets you pretty much anywhere you want to be at a price of $20 US. And if you're worried about, price to, length of gameplay, you're going to get plenty of gameplay for this, many hours of enjoyment, and in my opinion, a decent bit of replayability, which is kind of really good for survival horror. A lot of fans go crazy about that as well. But with that being said, I like to break my reviews down in a couple different ways, and depending on the game is how we do it. But today, we're going to break it down based off of the story, the presentation, and then finally we'll talk about the gameplay itself. So first off with the story. So obviously, I don't really want to spoil too much about the game. I think a lot of that joy comes from playing in and of itself, and I've always been really touchy about story spoilers after I got hit with a couple of negative comments in earlier reviews when talking about stuff that was in the trailer for a certain game. But to put it quite simply, you're a French soldier in the trenches of World War I, and as you're making your way through some of these different environments, there are some strong undertones and messages throughout the game, but obviously the major one is that war is horror. And that's where a lot of those actual horror elements come from in this game, is the tension and the buildup of the actual terror of war. And if I had to use the term subversion of expectations, in the earlier hours of the game, specifically the earlier hours, the game doesn't hold your hand, and it doesn't rush things along to be, super intense, scary monsters all the time, which, again, isn't a bad thing in horror. You don't need that. But it makes genuinely just combat against other humans, and I guess rats, you would say, terrifying. Not always in the sense that you mean, and while I'll get into why it's so tense in the gameplay section, I felt it was important to understand exactly how the game makes you feel, because that is such a strong aspect of the story in a horror game. That being said, I do think some story delivery is done, I don't want to say sloppily, but I will say that I didn't connect with it as well. There are notes around the world that you can find as on par with pretty much any horror game, and I think a lot of them do their job at painting the bleak picture of the situation you find yourself in. However, from time to time, it kind of asks a little more from the player as far as keeping track of which characters are which, and a lot of times you're not really meeting these characters. Again, a lot like Amnesia the Bunker, a similar situation, I actually praised in my review for that game the fact that I loved learning the arcs and story developments of characters I never met through different notes you found around the bunker. However, in this game, while it's not really exactly comparable, I don't think it handles it quite as well. I don't know what it is, but there's something there that my brain couldn't wrap around. And there are, of course, other forms of story delivery. There's the direct, actual narrative that you're going across, which is fine. And then, of course, there's some flashbacks as well. And those all do their job. And as we get into the presentation here, I'll talk about how it allows for a quick breather away from the actual bleak, grim, gritty visuals of the war itself. And without further ado, I guess we'll hop right into it. So I have to say, I love the variety of locations and the subdued feeling of the color palette within the game. So anytime you're in any of the wartime settings, you are subjected to a lot of the same dull, brown, grays, black color palettes. And I do think at times when you first look at an environment, it is a little hard to read what exactly is going on. But thankfully, due to the kind of pixel art nature and the enemies actually moving around, you can always kind of pinpoint exactly where the enemies are. It's just sometimes finding, where you can move and where you can't move is a little more difficult. And as a little side note, I will add on that all key items have a little flash on the screen, so you're never going to miss items like that, so that's also not a problem. But again, visually speaking, I think the game does a really great job. As you learn more about the different environments that you're actually traversing into, as you get into Chapter 2, Chapter 3, you realize that you become familiar with these environments very quickly. And it's in that way that the appreciation for each of the tiny details of it is really evident. But as I spent more and more time within the world of Conscript, the one thing that really stood out to me was actually the lighting of the game itself. Now, whether that be flashes on the screen when there's gunshots, to kind of, immerse the player in a way that a top-down game maybe normally couldn't, or simply the fact that when you're holding a light itself, that light source floods into any room and environment and is only prohibited by obstacles in the way. It's in that way that it's very logic-based and it's very intuitive. And another thing, with the top-down perspective, it also allows players to see exactly where they can travel in the dark. And outside of that, the only other visual I really wanted to talk about was the pixel art itself. So as I mentioned, I played a lot of this game on the Steam Deck, and the colors to the game pop really well. And that was without even playing on the OLED model. So I think the choices of the depth of the colors was done really well. And again, something I pointed out earlier, those quick little rebreathers, I'll show some on the screen here, of the more lush green environments as opposed to the dull brown and gray ones, is just such a nice, fresh breath of air. God damn it, I can't speak. And it's due to that kind of pacing. Pacing is a word I like to use a lot in my reviews. And one way or another, I always find that games pace themselves in different ways. Whether that be the combat, the story pacing, or actually the exploration. In this case, I would say it's more of a visual pacing to the game to not tire out the player. And I think the game does an exceptional job of that. But to go hand in hand with the visuals of the game when it comes to presentation, we also have to talk about the audio of the game. So the audio, I have literally next to no notes. I think they did a phenomenal job, whether it's the muffled screaming sound effects of a character in the background, or the soundtrack, which does an exceptional job of amplifying any tension that you have in a scene. I was really impressed by the audio to the game. My absolute favorite part of the soundtrack was when it actually imitates the sounds of sirens to, kind of indicate like a bombardment sound effect. And as you have planes actually flying over and bombing the trenches that you're in that instance, I thought it all kind of came together in a really interesting way of like, wow, this is both thematically in line with the war that you're a part of, but also tonally, it really sends, a little shiver up down your spine, up your arm hair, whatever you want to say. I'm sure all French people have really hairy arms. But in my opinion, it's also all of the little details in Conscript that really add up to a great audio experience. Whether it be the cocking of a weapon, giving that perfect ting, or the sounds of rubble or an explosion happening off in the distance or very close, or even your footsteps as you're on, dirt, wooden floors, or even metal railings. They all help to immerse the player in a way that once you actually delve deep into this experience and you really, go full lizard brain, it all comes together in such a way that you kind of forget you're playing a top-down styled game, and it just really is horror, which is exactly, in my opinion, the point. And while the story didn't make or break the game for me, and the presentation absolutely won me over, one thing I had to talk about that I really enjoyed overall was the gameplay itself. And the best way I can describe it is genuinely addictive. Now, I will say, as a little note, I don't think the enemy variety was amazing to the game, but it's the ways that you interact with both the world and your arsenal of weapons that I was really impressed with Conscript. So let's start at a base level. You are a soldier who can use guns, throwable items, and healing items to survive within World War I. Obviously, the arsenal of weapons can include different handguns, whether it be a revolver or otherwise, a rifle, a shotgun, you name it, it's going to be there. There's more, but those are the ones I'll say for now. And then very Resident Evil style, you have a limited inventory system, that you're going to have to make sure you have key items that you can either use or store for later in a chest at the save room. And also, like Resident Evil, you have items like, fabric or, chemicals, gunpowder, that you can combine with other items to make either ammunition, stronger healing items, and all of these things work relatively well. It hits those same satisfaction levels that you get from those games as well. Now, one thing that I have heard is also very Resident Evil, but I've personally never played Resident Evil 4, is that there is a merchant within this game at each of the save stations. You can interact with him by trading cigarettes for whatever item you need. And sometimes these can be very useful items that unlock potentially more loot, or they can be at face value. Hey, I'm buying more ammunition or healing items from this guy. And cigarettes you find around the world, they're plentiful enough. Like, I never felt like I had too many to where it was too easy, but I also didn't struggle to find any either. You don't get them from enemies, you just get them from exploring, so there are limited numbers. But I think it was handled just well enough on the normal difficulty to where I had to kind of pick and choose what I actually wanted, but it was also easy enough to get exactly the items that I needed as well. But I mentioned earlier there's key items, and I also mentioned in the presentation section that it's not too hard to find these items. Now, there is backtracking within the game once you find the actual items you need, and I do think that the pacing can be thrown off a bit here if you don't know exactly what you're doing. It's not always the most clear where you need to go, but it doesn't always feel like you're trying to throw yourself at a brick wall either. And I think the satisfaction of finding out these things on your own is really strong with this game because it is less handholdy. But really, the part that I actually find addictive is how you interact with the world and the combat itself. So I've already set up the weapons and the healing that you'll be using. So for the most part, you've got two types of weapons. You've got melee weapons and you've got, projectile weapons, aka guns. So all weapons work quite simply. You hold down the left trigger in order to make your reticle as tight as possible in order to accurately fire your weapons. Or, swing your weapon. I think it does more damage even if you hold it down more. So it becomes kind of a strategic game where if you're in combat, you want to get as much distance between you and the enemy that's charging at you. So you can either sprint away, or you do have like a dodge roll, which is very useful, especially against melee enemies. And it's that loop there that I think feels very rewarding. The combat scenarios that it hits you with, whether it be one really strong enemy, 2 or 3, weaker enemies, or just a bunch all at once. It's that loop that kind of keeps things fresh, while also each of the arenas challenges you to be on your toes a little bit. And really the last thing I want to talk about, which is the part that I absolutely love, this is my favorite aspect of this game, I saved the best for last. You can interact with the world in a couple of unique ways. One of which being that there are open areas or gaps in wire where enemies can pour back through. So I don't know if it's every time you enter the room that there's a chance that a new enemy will respawn, but if you get some wire, you can actually close up that fencing and make it to where there's no longer a chance for an enemy to return to that area, which is huge. Now another thing, when you actually do kill enemies in the game, the bodies don't go away. So that attracts flesh-hungry rats, of course. What else would it be? And because of that, you'll have to burn the bodies so they're no longer interested in that body. On top of that, there are holes where rats come out of, and if you throw a grenade in there, well, guess what? That deals with that rat problem indefinitely in that area, just like the repaired trench would. And stuff like this, and little attentions to detail that's present throughout the game that just absolutely won me over. Slap that on with a strong presentation, both with visuals and audio, and I have to admit, this is a must-play for any horror fan that really wants to be challenged. Whether that's actually by difficulty or the limited save with the ink ribbons, or just straight up from a horror perspective, the game asks a lot of the player, and I think that's really mature and appropriate for the subject matter of the game, and it's for that reason that I say this is one of my strongest recommends. And with that being said, my name is fallinghurts, and at the time of recording this, I've got another review coming out very soon. This is after a kind of drought on my channel for a while, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, subscribe. Really appreciate it. Trying to buy some, pond cleaning supplies. So, I really appreciate you watching the video this far, if you did. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.